Hey, it's Shannon May, your resident art wizard, and welcome to the art section of creating a Live2D Vtuber. In part 0, I discussed things to consider before creating your Vtuber, and now we're moving on to making your artwork Live2D ready. I hope you have your concept primed and ready to go. If you don't, feel free to go back to part 0. I'll pop a link on screen now. Don't worry, I'll still be here when you get back. But if you're ready and raring to go, let's dive right into part 1. Prepping your artwork for Live2D. So let's open up a new document. Your file must be saved as a PSD, short for Photoshop document, so make sure the software you're using can save in that format. The obvious choice is Photoshop, but it can be prohibitively expensive for beginners, so I'd actually recommend 𝗙𝗶𝗺𝗄𝗃, which is what I have up on screen right now. It has a free trial, so I'll pop a link in the description. There's also an iPad version for those of you that work on iPads, but I know that some older iPads can struggle with using a lot of layers, which you will have to use in this tutorial. So let's choose our canvas size. So we're going for an illustration up here. And our file name will be Vtuber. Sorry, nice keyboard ASMR there. Right, so if you're planning on using the free version of Live2D, you'll need to have your canvas size at 2048 by 2048 or below, as that's its limit. But if you're using Pro, you can go pretty gosh darn big, as long as your machine can handle it. But I generally recommend staying around 4 to 5k pixels square, so I'm going to go with 4k pixels, 72 resolution, because this is not going to be going to print, this is just on a screen. So we're going to quickly switch over, if I can get the right button. The right button will be good. There we go. So before I show you the process from scratch, we're going to spend a little bit of time having a look at my model. So when drawing a pose for your character, especially if you're doing a waist up, a standard A pose is pretty normal, but you can change that up. Bear in mind that whatever pose the model is in, that will be your default state for your VTuber, so having their arm constantly held up in a waving position might not be ideal. You'll also be able to tweak that default in Live2D if you wish later, but I've seen a few that look pretty cool with hands permanently holding a controller for gaming VTubers and other similar ideas, so it can definitely work. You don't have to use the A pose. You'll also want to make things as symmetrical as possible to make animation easier, especially the face, because that will mean later down the line you'll be able to do animation to turn one way, then copy and flip that animation to turn it the other way, which will save you a lot of time. If you're deliberately making your character asymmetrical, that's also okay, but bear in mind the extra work you will have to do. So a little tip for symmetry, 𝗙𝗶𝗺𝗃 has a symmetry ruler. So you just go over here to the symmetry ruler and choose symmetrical ruler. You want line symmetry. You don't have to create the editing layer. It will just create a new layer otherwise, but you can. And you just go free, and then if I hold shift and I draw up, it will create a line all the way down. And if I go grab my pen quickly, it will draw either side of the line. So it's best to do your sketch with this. You don't necessarily have to do the line art and stuff. But yeah, that is an easy way to get symmetry in 𝗙𝗶𝗺𝗃. Let's undo that. So Live2D makes a use of a concept known as puppet rigging. The key thing to keep in mind is that everything needs to be layered. Look at my layers palette, it is huge. You're going to be making copious use of this layers palette. Every part that moves independently needs to be separated onto its own layer, and the more layers you have, the more fine control you'll have over your model's animation. But also, the more complex it will be to keep track of all the moving parts. Now, you can do this from the get-go and set up your layers as you draw, which I would recommend doing to some extent. But there are certain parts that are a little bit trickier to do that with, like the eyes. If I just quickly open up that folder, got my right eye and left eye separated there. If I take off the fancy glasses, that'll be a bit easier to see. But you'll see that every part of this is separate. There's like 3 parts to the lashes. Generally, you should just note that the face is a much more complicated area than other parts because it's going to have the most expression and animation applied. Anyway, what I'm trying to get at is if you draw with layer separation in mind, you're going to have an easier ride later down the line. If you have already flattened your image completely already, it's not in vain. It's okay. If you're careful enough with your selection tool, you can still separate your parts. The trick is that you'll have to paint back in whatever was behind them. For example, painting skin tone behind where the eyes are, or extra hair underneath where a lock of hair was. See, look, like there is skin behind my eye. Otherwise, you'll find that when your model moves, you're going to get an ugly blank space and bold spots where the part initially was. I'll show you a bit more about that later, but for now, let's go into more detail on your layer hierarchy. So I'm going to pop it on screen now. This is the hierarchy I'm using at the moment. Feel free to use folders to organize things, or it'll get messy very quickly. Live2D didn't used to support folder import very well, so some older tutorials will tell you not to do this, but I promise you it works now in the current Live2D. Make sure to also separate left and right parts, for example, your left and right ear, and also make sure your layers are in the right order. For example, you'll have parts of the hair that are in front of the face and parts that are behind. You can modify this once you get into Live2D, but it's easier to fix everything now before you start. So the body, at a minimum, I split the body into neck, torso, chest, and arms. You can further split upper arms onto separate layers, lower arms onto separate layers, and hands onto separate layers. You can also split up the fingers if you're planning to animate them, but in this case I haven't. If you're wearing layered clothes, it's also beneficial to, say, separate a coat from a shirt, for example. Other separations you may want are for waist, upper leg, lower leg, and feet if you're doing a full body model. Moving on to the main face, you'll need the face base, which is just the skin at the back, separate ears, separate eyebrows, blush, and nose. In the case of my model, I've combined my freckles with the blush layer, but if you have additional facial features like freckles, you can separate those out too. So the eye up here, each part will have a left and right version, but as standard, you'll need eye white, eye shine, top lashes, bottom lashes, and side lashes, eyelid, and finally the pupil and iris here. The final 2 can be combined in most cases, but you might wish to leave them separate to help you fine-tune animations down the line. The iris can be bigger than the whole white eye section. Don't worry, when we get into Live2D, we'll make sure it can only be seen inside the eye whites, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. So the mouth. At minimum, the mouth needs an upper lip section, a lower lip section, and an inner mouth color. There we go. This is the inside of my mouth. I know it's kind of horrific. So we've also got teeth and tongue in here, and you could also have a separate chin line if your character has that. You'll notice the upper and lower lip have some overlapping skin attached, which will be used in the method of mouth animation that I use. And we're going to be using that later in the tutorial, so be sure to paint those in. Hair can really be as complicated as you want it to be. At minimum, you want the back of the hair, the sides of the hair separate, and then the bangs separated. You can separate each and every strand if you want to do complex hair animation, but if this is your first model, my advice is, well, don't, honestly. I just want to quickly segue into a bit of setup for bold characters too, as they don't get much love in tutorials. To achieve a better head movement for a bold character, the head base is divided up for animation purposes instead of the hair. I'll pop that on screen here just so you can see like an idea of what I mean. So it's all well and good separating things out, but you've probably already noticed from looking at my model that I've drawn things in that you can't see. And that's because when I'm animated, my parts move. So I just quickly get rid of these right now. Get rid of that whole eye section. Have a look at the hair front because that's the most obvious place to see it. You'll be able to see ugly voids that you didn't draw in. Say, if I didn't have the mid parts of my hair. Those mid parts of my hair, even though they're not particularly obvious right now, those go under the hair there, and then when I turn left and right, they will be more visible, and they basically cover up a void. You can see it on my model a bit if I turn around a little bit here. You can see that hair just wasn't visible when I'm facing you, and now I turn back. So yeah, that's the basic principle of the whole model. So let's bring up the demo model. So you can watch how I sketch and draw in everything from the ground up here. Sped up by the power of magic, of course. By the way, this, my friend, is what happens when you try to draw a model without a reference sheet or any real full concept in mind, as I mentioned in part 0. Do as I say, not as I do. I'll go through several color iterations and play around with things that should have totally been nailed down by this point. But little tutorial Chan here is just for demo purposes, so I didn't feel she really needed a lore sheet. Now, I haven't even named this little friend yet, so if you have any suggestions, feel free to pop them in the comments, as they're going to be accompanying us on the rest of our magical Live2D journey from here on out. Note again that parts are drawn here so that they overlap, and any part that will be revealed by animation are also drawn in, such as the back of the hair. I know I mentioned this point earlier, but I really can't drive the draw things you can't see point home enough, as it's the biggest newbie mistake I see preparing art for puppet animation. So here's my final layer hierarchy at this point. I'll leave it on screen for a little bit, so feel free to pause here. Then we'll go into a closer deep dive into the layers. So let's go through one by one from the backmost layer, just to make sure we're 100% sure how this is laid out. The hair base. This is the far back of the head and needs to cover the entire head area. I called this layer here backside hair. This is another layer on top of the hair base to give the back parts of the hair a little more depth when animating. You'll note that this still has a wide range of red there. It's not just those lines. The neck. The neck needs to extend a little further into the model, as more of the neck will be revealed when the head tilts to look upwards. Left and right shoes. Those are pretty self-explanatory. The upper and lower legs are next. These are not separated by line art, but instead joined together with an overlapping colour, just in case I want to animate a bend at the knee. They extend into each other so that there will be no gaps when animating. Left and right arms. I chose to have the arms, sleeves and hands as one piece. I don't plan for any wrist animation here, but I could go back and separate these later if I change my mind. The main torso, labelled as shirt main. This chest area is filled in behind where the chest layer is going to be as well. So then we get the chest layer, which is just on top of the torso. The final part of the body piece is the tail. I worked out it doesn't matter which way my little mousey turns, you're very unlikely to see the back part of the tail. So only the section curled around her leg is drawn in. I might go back later and do the back part if any animation starts seeming weird, but for now this is a conscious choice to cut down on moving parts. The less you have, the easier it will be to manage your model. But let's move on to the face. Firstly, the face base. This is the canvas that all your face parts will be on, and the full skull is drawn beneath the hair. Secondly, we look at the construction of the mouth. The mouth inner, tongue, a cute little snaggletooth, and then the mouth bottom and mouth top, which closes up like that. They have a piece of skin attached, as my model earlier, which covers the inner mouth during animations when they're not needed. Then we move on to the ears. Again, the whole thing is drawn, even though part will be hidden by the hair. You will have actually noticed there are some very faint purple lines They've been on some other pieces earlier, and this is just to show where things cross over. They won't be on the final model. Next, the parts that make up the eyes. The left eyebrow, right eyebrow, the eye whites are here, left and right pupils, the middle lashes, the bottom lashes, and the top lashes. And then we get the rest of the facial features, which will be the plushies and the nose. So the final parts are the front parts of the hair. The side bangs are split into left and right. There we go. And the front bangs are one solid piece. You could also cut the bangs up further, probably into about 3 parts, if you wanted some more precise animation. Before we're done with the artwork and we finally import everything to Live2D, our last task is to sketch in approximately what we want our left, right, up and down facings to look like, all on separate layers, as you can use them as guide images later. This step is technically optional, but it will help you down the line to get the animations looking correct. It depends on the angles used on your reference sheet as well. You might just be able to use those. With this little mouse, I'm doing some really quick sketches just to get a feel for where the pieces are going to move. I'll just speed it up here while I finish these off. And there you have it. Your artwork is ready for import, and I can see you're eager to keep going. Don't forget to like and subscribe for when the next part drops. Also, I want to give a big thanks for hitting 50 subscribers. To celebrate, I've just released a new enamel pin design featuring my fancy hat and one of my fancy cats, if you're interested. I'll leave a link in the description below. It's been fantastic to have you along for this magical ride, and I hope to see you in the next video. Have a great day. Goodbye.